The brand on Della Underwood's heart had no shape that anyone could see, but every soul in Redemption Creek, Texas, knew it was there, pressed deep into her like iron held too long in the fire. It was the autumn of 1882 when Cecil Bancroft rode into town on a dust-gray mare with one white sock, carrying nothing but a bedroll, a battered Winchester, and a reputation for honest work that had drifted ahead of him on the wind from 3 counties east. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered in a way that suggested labor rather than vanity, with dark eyes that had the particular quality of taking in everything without appearing to look at anything at all. He had not come to Redemption Creek looking for a woman. He had come because the foreman at the Double Spur Ranch had sent word that they needed a man who could break horses without breaking their spirits, and Cecil Bancroft had always had a gift for understanding the difference between a wild thing and a ruined one. Redemption Creek sat in the flat bowl between 2 limestone ridges in Caldwell County, a town of perhaps 400 souls who had built their lives in the particular stubborn fashion of people who had decided to stay where others had given up. There was a main street of packed caliche clay, a mercantile run by a German family named Hofstetter, a saloon called the Ivory Rail, a church whose white paint peeled in the summer heat, and a small post office that doubled as the telegraph station. There was also a bakery and a laundry and a modest boarding house, and it was in the bakery that Della Underwood had worked for the past 6 years, ever since everything she had believed in had turned to ash in her hands. She was 28, though people who did not know her sometimes mistook her for older because of the quietness that lived around her. She was not old in her face. She was old in her stillness. She had brown hair the color of creek-bottom mud when the water runs clear over it, and gray eyes that had once been described as lively and were now described, when people were being kind, as steady. She baked bread every morning before dawn. She iced wedding cakes for other women without flinching, at least not in any way that anyone could see. She kept her small rented room at the boarding house clean, and her small circle of acquaintances pleasant and her small walls very, very high. 6 years ago, a man named Thomas Aldridge had stood up in the Redemption Creek Church and said his vows to another woman 7 days after writing Della a letter of such tenderness that she had read it 17 times and memorized most of it before she understood it was a farewell. They had been promised to each other in the informal way of the frontier, which is to say in the way of 2 people who had spoken plainly of a future and been understood. And she had spent 2 years believing in that future with the wholehearted sincerity of a woman who did not do things by halves. Thomas Aldridge had married a banker's daughter from Austin who came with money and a house already built, and Della Underwood had smiled at the wedding because she worked the reception and could not afford to do anything else, and she had pressed that smile against the inside of her face like a tourniquet, and had not removed it until she was alone in her room that night. She had cried for 3 days. Then she had gotten up, put on her work dress, gone to the bakery where she had been a part-time helper, and asked if she could have a full-time position. The owner, a widow named Agnes Prout, had looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a woman who understood more than was being said, and had handed her an apron without a word of discussion. That had been the beginning of the years that followed, the years that were shaped by early mornings and flower dust, and the particular armor of a woman who had decided that the world could not hurt her again if she simply did not want anything from it. She was not miserable. That was the complicated part of it, the part that made her story harder to tell than the stories of women who wore their grief openly. She was competent and respected, and occasionally even cheerful in the manner of someone who has found reliable satisfaction in work. She laughed at things that were funny. She was kind to the children who came in with their pennies for a sweet roll. She helped when help was needed. She simply did not open the interior rooms of herself to anyone, and she had been so consistent in this for so long that most people in Redemption Creek had stopped expecting otherwise. Cecil Bancroft tied his mare at the rail in front of the Ivory Rail on his first evening in town, and went inside for a meal and a single glass of whiskey, which was his habit in a new place, eating in the public room so he could get his bearings on the character of the town before he committed to anything more specific. The saloon was quiet on a Tuesday. Two men played cards at a corner table with the concentrated silence of men who were not playing for money, but for the pleasure of concentration. The barkeep was a round-faced man named Petey Clune, who poured generously and talked in the informational manner of a man who had decided that conversation was part of the service. "Double spur, you said," Petey repeated, sliding the glass across the bar. "That's Harlan Brooks' operation. Good man, fair wages, you'll eat well anyway. His cook out there is a man named Alejandro who came up from Monterey, and I don't know what he puts in his beans, but I have heard grown men weep about it." "That's high praise," Cecil said. "Where are you coming from?" "Gonzales County last. Before that the Panhandle. Before that a little of everywhere." Petey nodded with the practiced neutrality of a barkeep receiving a life story in its compressed form. "You have people here?" "No, just the work." He ate his meal, which was passable, and listened to the room, and at some point Petey mentioned, in the rambling way of a man filling silence, that the bakery on the main street made the best sourdough bread he had eaten outside of San Antonio, and that the woman who ran it, Della Underwood, delivered a dozen loaves to the saloon kitchen every Thursday morning, and that she was the kind of woman a man noticed. Cecil did not say anything to this, but he registered it in the quiet way he registered most things. He rode out to the Double Spur the next morning, met Harlan Brooks, a weathered man of 50 with the handshake of someone who had spent decades doing the handshake test and valued the results, and was hired by noon. He was given a bunk in the ranch hands' quarters, a section of fenced paddock to work in, and an introduction to 6 Mustangs that Harlan described as difficult, with the slight understatement of a man who liked to see how the new hand responded to the word. Cecil walked the fence line of the paddock for a long time before he got close to any of the horses. He did this every time. He let them see him, let them measure him, let them decide he was not a threat before he even tried to be anything else. One of the other hands, a young Mexican man named Esteban Ruiz, who was 17 and had been at the Double Spur for 2 years, watched this from the fence rail with evident curiosity. "Most of the men who come to break horses get in fast," Esteban said. "I know," Cecil said without looking away from the Mustangs. "That one in the corner, the roan, she already threw 2 men. She's not mean," Cecil said quietly. "She's scared. There's a difference." Esteban tilted his head and considered this. Then he nodded slowly, as though it had explained something beyond the immediate subject. Cecil spent the first 2 weeks at the Double Spur, establishing himself in the thorough, unremarkable way of a man who did good work and did not make trouble, and he would have had very little reason to visit Redemption Creek at all in those early weeks, except that Harlan Brooks sent him in to collect a special order from the mercantile, a set of ironwork fittings that had been shipped from San Antonio and were being held at Hofstadter's, and it happened to be a Thursday morning. He was coming out of the Hofstadter mercantile with the package under one arm when he saw her. She was carrying a wooden crate down the main street in the direction of the ivory rail, walking with the purpose of a woman who knew exactly where she was going and had no patience for any interruption in getting there. Her brown hair pinned up under a flour-dusted hat, a white apron still tied at her waist over a blue dress that was practical rather than pretty and managed to be both anyway. The crate was clearly heavy and she was managing it without complaint, but there was a slight unevenness in her step that spoke of a crate that was either heavier or more awkward than she had calculated. He did not think much about it. He just stepped off the boardwalk and said, "Can I take half that?" She stopped and looked at him with gray eyes that assessed the offer with the rapid and unsentimental efficiency of a woman who had learned to evaluate strangers quickly. "I've got it," she said. "I can see that. I'm just heading in the same direction." She held his gaze for a moment, and he understood something in that moment, not about her specifically, but about the quality of her caution, the way a careful animal holds still before it decides whether to move. He did not push. He just stood there with a mild expression and waited. "Fine," she said finally, and he took one end of the crate without making anything of it. They walked the half-block to the ivory rail's back entrance in silence that was not unfriendly but was not open either, and set the crate down together, and she thanked him in the brief, neutral manner of a woman who accepted practical assistance as a transaction and nothing more. "Cecil Bancroft," he said. "I'm out at the double spur." "Della Underwood," she said, and he could see her weighing whether to extend the conversation further and deciding against it. "Good morning to you." She was already turning back to the street before the sentence was finished. He watched her go for a moment, not with any particular intention, just with the same mild attention he gave to most things, and then he collected his package and rode back to the ranch. He thought about her occasionally in the weeks that followed, in the way a man thinks about an interesting puzzle he has no particular urgency to solve. There was something in those few seconds of interaction that had landed in him with quiet weight, the assessment in her eyes, the practiced self-sufficiency of her manner, the way she had said her own name with a certain flatness, as though she had long since stopped expecting it to mean anything to anyone. The next time he saw her was 3 weeks later, at the church service that he attended partly out of habit, and partly because it was a useful way to become known in a community, without having to navigate individual introductions. Redemption Creek's church was presided over by a good-natured minister named Reverend Ashby, who gave sermons of moderate length and considerable practical wisdom, and the congregation was small enough that a new face was noticed. Della Underwood sat 3 rows from the front on the left side, alone, which he gathered was her established position. She wore a dark green dress that was her Sunday dress. He would later learn, the nicest thing she owned, and she sang the hymns in a low, clear voice that she did not offer loudly but that he found he was listening for, standing 2 rows behind her and to the right. After the service she spoke to Agnes Prout and to a woman with red hair named Josephine Calloway, who was the wife of the postmaster, and she exchanged polite words with Reverend Ashby, and then she walked back toward the boarding house alone, and Cecil, who happened to be going the same direction to pick up the horse he had left at the public rail, fell into a loose parallel path that was not quite walking together and not quite not. "You're settling in at the double spur," she said without looking at him, which meant she had noticed him without appearing to, which told him something. "Yes, ma'am, it suits me. Harlan Brooke is a good employer," she said. "He doesn't owe money to anyone in this town, and he treats his Mexican hands the same as his white hands, which is not something every rancher around here can say." "I've seen that," Cecil said. "I respect it." There was a pause in which the dry November wind pushed a handful of dust across the street between them, and then she said, "You're good with horses. Esteban told Josephine Calloway's husband, who told Josephine, who told me." He smiled slightly. "Word travels in a small town." "Everything travels in a small town," she said, and there was something in it, not bitterness, but a kind of resigned fact, the acknowledgement of a woman who had been the subject of traveling words and had survived it. They parted at the corner without ceremony, but this time she was the one who glanced back slightly, a motion so small he would not have caught it if he had not been paying the kind of attention that had become a habit around her without him fully deciding to make it so. December arrived with unusual cold for that part of Texas, and Cecil found himself riding into Redemption Creek more frequently than strictly necessary, picking up small items from the mercantile, taking a meal at the Ivory Rail, stopping at the post office for the occasional letter from a sister in Lockhart who wrote with the warm persistence of a woman determined to stay connected to a brother who moved too much. He told himself each time that these trips were simply the natural socialization of a man settling into a new territory, and this was partially true, and the other partial truth was that the bakery was on the main street, and he had developed a habit of stopping there for coffee on cold mornings. The bakery had 2 small tables near the front window that Agnes Prout had installed for the purpose of accommodating customers who wanted to eat their rolls warm, and Cecil made use of these with reasonable frequency, and Della served him with the same pleasant, contained efficiency she offered everyone, and gradually, over many such mornings, a conversation developed. It developed slowly. It developed in the manner of something that was not being pushed, which meant it grew in the directions it wanted to grow rather than in the directions someone was trying to force it. He asked her about the bread, which she talked about with a quiet expertise that was the first time he had heard real enthusiasm in her voice. She asked him about the horses, and he talked about the roan mustang and the particular patience required to win her confidence, and something in Della's expression shifted fractionally, the way a face shifts when something resonates deeper than the surface level of conversation. "The ones who have been frightened need more time," she said. "Yes," he said, and he looked at her in a way that was not aggressive but was not casual either, the look of a man who had understood a second meaning and was deciding whether to acknowledge it. He decided not to. Not yet. Maybe not ever. It was not his business, but it stayed with him. Christmas in Redemption Creek was celebrated with the modest festivity of a frontier town, a tree in the church, a community dinner in the Hofstetter family's large barn, music from Petey Clune, who played the fiddle considerably better than he mixed drinks, and the general gathering of people who spent most of their days in practical isolation and valued the excuse for proximity. Cecil attended and found himself at the far end of a table from Della, who sat beside Agnes Prout and helped serve the younger children their food before serving herself, the gesture of a woman who had been doing for others so long it had become instinct. He had bought small gifts for the people he had come to know in his months in Redemption Creek. A tin of tobacco for Petey, a good length of rope for Esteban, a set of letters for Agnes Prout's granddaughter who was learning to read. And for Della, he had spent considerable time in Hofstetter's Mercantile before selecting a small tin of Ceylon tea, which Petey had mentioned she preferred to coffee when she could get it, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a bit of red string that the Hofstetter daughter had added without his asking. He left it at the bakery door on Christmas morning with no note. He was not sure why he made it anonymous, and then told himself it was because he did not want her to feel obligated, which was true, and then admitted to himself later on his ride back to the double spur that he had also made it anonymous, because he was not quite ready for what it would mean if she knew it was from him. She found out anyway. Small towns. Josephine Calloway told her husband the postmaster had seen Cecil Bancroft at Hofstetter's asking for Ceylon tea specifically, and this intelligence reached Della before the day was out. She did not say anything to him about it the next time she saw him. She simply, the following Thursday when she delivered to the ivory rail and stopped at the public rail where his horse happened to be tied, placed a small cloth bundle on his saddle bag without looking for him first. He found it when he went to ride back. Inside was a piece of sourdough bread, the good kind, the kind she baked Thursdays and reserved for people she considered worth the effort, wrapped carefully, still faintly warm. There was no note from her either. He ate it on the way back to the double spur and did not exaggerate when he later told Esteban it was the best bread he had tasted in his adult life. January of 1883 brought the kind of weather that tested the sincerity of anyone who had claimed to love Texas, relentless blue northers that came down from the panhandle with nothing to stop them, dropping the temperature to freezing and keeping it there for days at a time. The horses were miserable, and the cattle were miserable, and the ranch hands were miserable, and Cecil spent long frozen days working in the paddocks and longer frozen evenings in the bunkhouse playing cards with Esteban, and a quiet older hand named George Fry, who had come up from the border country 20 years ago and had seen most things twice. On one of the coldest evenings, word came from Redemption Creek that the Calloway family's barn had caught fire from an overheated stove, and half the town turned out to help. Cecil rode in with Harlan Brooke and 3 other hands, and they worked through the night hauling water and pulling down the portions of the structure that were threatening the adjacent buildings, and by 4 in the morning the fire was controlled and the damage, while significant, had been contained to the barn itself. Della was there. She and Agnes Prout had come with hot coffee and cornbread, working from the back of Agnes's wagon, feeding the men who were working the fire line with the quiet efficiency of women who understood that feeding people was its own kind of fighting. Cecil came to the wagon twice during the night for coffee, and she poured without comment the first time, and the second time said, "You've got a burn on your left hand." He looked down. "Just a small one. Come around to the back of the wagon." She cleaned and wrapped the burn with the same practical competence she brought to everything, her hands steady and warm against the cold night, and he watched her face while she worked, the concentration in it, the complete absence of fuss, and something in him went very quiet and very warm in a way that had nothing to do with the coffee. "Thank you," he said when she finished. She looked up at him, and for just a second before the wall came back up, he saw something in her eyes that was neither steady nor contained, something that looked, if he read it right, a great deal like being seen and being frightened by it in equal measure. "Go back and get warm," she said, and turned to pour coffee for the next man in line. February arrived, and with it the slow return of warmth to the Texas air, and Cecil Bancroft understood with the same quiet certainty he brought to the recognition of a horse's nature that he was in love with Della Underwood. He did not arrive at this conclusion dramatically. He arrived at it the way a man arrives at the edge of a property line he has been walking toward for some time. He simply looked up one morning and realized he was there. He was not certain what to do with the conclusion. He had gathered enough about her history, in the accumulated way one gathers information in a small town, to understand that someone had done her a serious wrong, that the wrong had been sufficient to close something in her that had not reopened, and that she had spent 6 years building a life that was functional and competent, and almost entirely sealed against the particular kind of hurt that comes from wanting something from another person. He knew he could not simply tell her. He knew that announcing his feelings would be, for a woman in her position, less a gift than a burden, the sudden weight of someone else's wanting landing on a person who had organized her entire existence around not being beholden to that weight. So he did not announce anything. He simply continued to be present, in all the ways available to him, and he made sure his presence was entirely without demand. He stopped at the bakery most Thursday mornings. He helped carry things when carrying was needed. He attended the same church services. He fixed the loose board on Agnes Prout's back step on a Sunday afternoon in March, because he noticed it was loose and Agnes was 70 years old and loose boards were a danger. And Della was there when he did it and watched him work without comment, but brought him a glass of cold water from the well that she had clearly gone some distance out of her way to bring. He thanked her for the water. She said it was nothing. He said it wasn't. She looked at him for a slightly longer moment than usual, which he had begun to map carefully, the incremental lengthening of her regard. In April, a man came to Redemption Creek whose name was Preston Aldridge, and Cecil learned from Petey at the Ivory Rail that Preston was the younger brother of Thomas Aldridge, who had married the banker's daughter from Austin and moved away and had died the previous spring of a fever, and that Preston had come to settle some of Thomas's remaining affairs that had been sitting undone, because Thomas had left debts in Redemption Creek before his prosperous marriage that had never been properly settled. Preston Aldridge was a loud man of 35 with the particular unearned confidence of someone who had always been bilaid out by proximity to more capable people, and he arrived at the bakery on his second day in town with the air of a man who considered himself a visitor of significance. Cecil was at his usual table when Preston came in, and he watched with the careful attention he typically reserved for animals in uncertain situations as Preston Aldridge leaned on Della's counter and spoke to her with an ease that was either genuine familiarity or its calculated imitation. And as Della's face went through a series of extremely rapid adjustments, a flash of something raw, quickly covered, then professional, then still. "Della Underwood," Preston said, as though her name was a pleasant surprise to him. "You're looking well. Thomas always said you were the prettiest thing in this county." "Good morning," Della said in a voice made entirely of polished stone. "I'm just here to sort out some old business. Won't be more than a week or two. I wonder if I could get a loaf of that bread. Thomas used to talk about it." She sold him the bread with a transaction that was swift and flawless and entirely closed. And Preston left with his purchase, and a casual backward glance that suggested he expected to be found appealing. And Della stood at the counter for a moment after the door closed with her hands flat on the wood and her head slightly bowed, and the kind of stillness that is the exterior of something moving very fast. Then she looked up and saw Cecil at the corner table, and her expression shifted into the controlled pleasantness she had perfected. "More coffee," she said. "No, thank you," he said gently. "I think I'm about ready to head out." He rose, put his coins on the table, and on his way to the door he paused and said, quietly so only she could hear, "That man had no right to come in here and throw your history at you like it was entertainment." She stared at him. "And for what it's worth," he said, "I think whoever walked away from you was the loser in that arrangement, not you." He put on his hat and went out. He did not look back. He gave her no opportunity to deflect or diminish the thing he had said. He simply said it and left her with it, and rode back to the double spur, and spent the afternoon working the roan mustang, who had by this point progressed to accepting a saddle blanket, and had even, on 2 occasions, allowed herself to be led around the paddock with Cecil's hand steady on the halter rope. Della spent most of that afternoon in a state of internal disruption that she managed, as she managed most internal disruptions, by working through it. She shaped 12 loaves, cleaned the entire back room, scrubbed the counter twice, and then stood in the early evening light of the bakery after Agnes had gone home and thought about what it felt like to have someone speak honestly on her behalf when she had not asked for it and had not expected it. She thought about the way he always sat in the corner, not the center, never demanding. She thought about the tea at Christmas. She thought about the way he had held her wrapped hand for just 1 extra second in the cold dark of the Callaway fire night before releasing it, the warmth of that. She did not cry. She had not cried in a long time, not over anything related to herself. But there was a looseness in her chest she had not felt in years, something that had the uncomfortable quality of a thing beginning to undo. She was frightened by it. She went home. She lay in her boarding house room in the dark and listened to the spring peepers in the creek bed behind the building, and told herself very firmly that she was fine as she was, that fine was enough, that wanting more was the first step toward the particular pain she had no intention of revisiting. But she thought about his hands, the burnt one she had wrapped, and the way he had said that whoever walked away from her was the loser, and she did not quite manage to hold the feeling entirely at bay. Preston Aldridge was in town for nearly 2 weeks, which was longer than he had announced, and in that time he visited the bakery 4 more times. He was not threatening. He was not cruel. He was simply a man who had grown up around a story in which Della Underwood was a peripheral figure in his family's narrative, and he treated her with the casual carelessness of someone who had never considered that a peripheral figure might have her own interior life that had been significantly affected by that story. He made small jokes about old times. He mentioned Thomas with a thoughtless ease that suggested he genuinely did not understand what those mentions cost. On his 3rd visit, Cecil was there. He came in behind Preston by about 2 minutes, sat at his table, ordered coffee, and from the corner of the room maintained the calm, steady presence that had become in Della's experience a strange form of anchor. He did not interfere. He did not cause trouble. He simply was there, and she found that his being there made Preston's careless conversation easier to bear, as though she had something solid to stand against. She was not sure when she had started thinking of him that way, but she had. Preston Aldridge settled Thomas's debts with the mercantile and the post office and the grain supplier, paid them from an envelope of cash with the air of a man doing a noble thing, and left Redemption Creek on a Wednesday morning in the 2nd week of April without further ceremony. The town returned to its usual self. Della returned to her usual rhythms, but something had shifted in those rhythms in a way she could feel but had not yet named. She named it on a Thursday morning in May. Cecil came in for coffee as usual and she brought it, and he said thank you as usual, and she turned to go back behind the counter, and then she turned back because she had decided sometime in the dark of the previous night that she was tired of carrying the weight alone and that there was something she needed to say. "I want to ask you something," she said. He looked up, open and waiting. "Why do you come in every Thursday?" He considered the question with the same serious attention he gave to everything. "Because the coffee is good," he said, "and because I like the company. Most men who like company say so differently. I'm not most men." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the main street of Redemption Creek went about its May morning business, horses and wagons and the sound of Hofstadter's delivery boy calling out to someone across the street. "Thomas Aldridge," she said. It was the first time she had said the name aloud and she could not calculate how long. "He made me a certain kind of fool, the kind who builds things in her head that aren't being built on the other side. I'm not interested in being that kind of fool again." "I understand that," Cecil said. "So I need you to tell me," she said, with a directness that cost her something. He could see it in the set of her jaw. "Whether you are coming in every Thursday because you like the coffee, or whether you are coming in every Thursday because of something else." He set his cup down carefully. He looked at her with the dark eyes that took in everything, and he said, "Something else." The word landed in the quiet of the bakery like a stone dropped into still water, and Della Underwood stood very still and let the rings of it move outward through her. "All right," she said finally. Her voice was not entirely steady. "I'm not going to rush you," he said. "I'm not going to tell you what to feel or when to feel it. I'm just telling you the truth because you asked for it and you deserve an honest answer." She nodded, very small. She went back behind the counter. He drank his coffee. Neither of them said anything else for several minutes, and then Agnes came in from the back and the morning resumed its normal texture. But Della, shaping dough with her hands while Agnes talked about the weather and the upcoming town meeting about the water supply issue, felt that looseness in her chest again, bigger now and less frightening than it had been before, though she would not have said it was comfortable either. That evening she told Josephine Calloway that Cecil Bancroft had told her plainly that he came to the bakery for her, and Josephine Calloway said, in the manner of a woman who had been waiting for this moment with some impatience, "Della Louise Underwood, of course he does. The entire town has known this for months, including my husband who usually notices nothing." "I'm not sure what to do with it," Della said. "You could let him take you to supper." "I am not sure I am ready for supper." "Then start smaller." She started with a walk. On a Sunday afternoon in May, she allowed Cecil Bancroft to walk with her to the limestone ridge on the east side of town that looked out over the flat country, which was her habit on Sunday afternoons when she could manage the hour away. It was the first time she had shared the walk with anyone. He did not fill the walk with unnecessary conversation. He walked beside her at a comfortable distance, and when she pointed out the things she knew about the country, the particular cactus that bloomed only 2 weeks a year, the line of old post oak trees that marked an ancient trail, the way the light went amber over the limestone at this hour, he listened with genuine interest and asked questions that showed he had been listening. At the top of the ridge they stood in the May wind and looked out over the country together, and she thought that it had been a very long time since she had stood anywhere with anyone and felt the particular ease of a companionship that asked nothing. "I'm not easy to know," she said, looking at the country. "I know that," he said. "Thomas used to say I was too serious." "I don't think you're too serious," Cecil said. "I think you're serious about the things that deserve it." She looked at him. He was looking at the country, giving her the room to look at him without the weight of being watched back, which she was beginning to understand was one of the particular courtesies he practiced, always making space for her to move toward or away without pressure. "You're a careful man," she said. "With things worth being careful with," he agreed. They walked back to town as the sun went low, and at the corner where their paths divided, he said, "Same time next Sunday." And she said, after a pause that she allowed herself honestly rather than pretending the answer came easily, "Yes." They walked every Sunday in May. In June, when the town held its annual summer fair in the field beside the church, he bought her a glass of lemonade, and they stood together watching the children's foot races. And it was the first time they had appeared in public together in a way that could be interpreted as intentional. And Redemption Creek noted this with the collective interest of a small community that had been somewhat invested in the story all along. Agnes Prout told Della afterward that she looked younger than she had in years. Della told Agnes not to be sentimental. Agnes said she was not being sentimental, she was being accurate, and there was a difference. Della went home and sat in front of her small mirror for a longer time than usual, not out of vanity, but out of something like curiosity about whether she looked different from the outside when she felt different on the inside. She thought perhaps she did. In July, there was trouble. It came in the form of a dry lightning storm that swept in from the west on a Saturday night with no warning. The kind of storm the Texas summer produced with a particular carelessness. And one of the lightning strikes caught the eastern hay barn at the double spur and set it going before anyone could reach it. No people were hurt and the horses were brought out safely, but the barn was a total loss, and 3 months of stored hay was gone with it, which was a serious problem for a ranch heading into the second half of summer. Cecil was not hurt, but he had gone in twice through smoke for horses that had not come out on their own, and had gotten them both out, and had come away from it with scorched eyebrows and a raw throat, and the shaken hands of a man who had run on adrenaline for 20 minutes straight and was now on the other side of it. Della heard about it Sunday morning at church, through Esteban's account to Reverend Ashby of the night's events, and she heard the part about Cecil going in for the horses and felt something move through her that was unmistakably fear and was therefore, she understood in that moment with complete clarity, the irrefutable confirmation of something she had already suspected. She walked to the double spur that Sunday for the first time, the 4 miles out on the ranch road in the July heat, because she needed to see that he was whole before she could think clearly about anything else. He was in the paddock with Esteban when she arrived, both of them leaning on the fence rail in the exhausted manner of men who had not slept, and the scorched smell still hung around everything. He looked up and saw her coming across the yard, and something changed in his face that had not been there before, a relief or a gladness or both. "You walked out here," he said. "I heard you went in for the horses twice. They needed coming out. Cecil." She said his name, his given name, for the first time, and they both registered the shift of it. "Don't do something like that without thinking it through." "I thought it through," he said. "There was time." She looked at him for a long moment, standing in the July heat with her good Sunday dress dusty from the road, and then she crossed the remaining distance between them and took his hand, the one she had wrapped before, which was no longer injured but which her hand seemed to find without particular instruction, and she held it in both of hers. "I need you to be careful," she said quietly. He turned his hand to hold hers back. His voice when he answered was very gentle. "I will," he said. "I promise." Esteban, with the excellent judgment of a young man who had spent the better part of a year watching these two people operate around each other, found something requiring his attention on the other side of the ranch yard. They stood like that for a little while in the shade of the fence rail, her hands around his, and the summer air around them full of the smell of burnt wood and dry grass, and the horses moving quietly in the paddock, and something that had been held very tightly in Della Underwood for 6 years began, with a kind of cautious and aching grace, to ease. She walked back to town before noon, and he rode alongside her on his mare for the first mile before the ranch road met the main road, and at the fork he said, "Next Sunday." "Yes," she said, without any hesitation at all. The Sundays continued, and with them an accumulation of small moments that were the substance of something growing. He came to the bakery now not only on Thursdays but on occasional Saturday mornings when he could get into town, and she began saving him the end of the sourdough loaf, the heel, which was her own favorite piece and which she handed over without explanation, and he received it the same way, without explanation, just quietly took it and understood what it meant. In August she showed him the small garden she kept behind the boarding house, tomatoes and chilies, and a few rows of herbs that she grew from seeds she had traded for with the Hofstadter daughter, and she talked about them with the same quiet expertise she brought to the bread, and he listened and helped her stake a tomato plant that had fallen in the recent wind, and their hands brushed over the same stake and neither of them moved away. "I think," he said very carefully, "that I would like to take you to supper. A proper supper at the Ivory Rail, or wherever you would prefer." She was quiet for a moment. Her hands were in the dirt of the garden bed, which meant she was grounded in a way she sometimes needed to be. "The Ivory Rail is fine," she said. Whenever you say." "Saturday week," she said, "if you can get into town." "I'll get into town," he said. The supper was a quiet revelation. The Ivory Rail was not much as restaurants went. Oil lamp tables and plain wooden furniture and food that ran to steak and potatoes. But it was the nicest establishment in Redemption Creek, and everyone knew what it meant to be seen there across a table from someone. Petey Clune greeted them with a warmth that was not subtle, and found them a good corner table, and left them alone with the particular tact of a man who understood the weight of the occasion. They talked for 2 hours. They talked about things they had not talked about in all the Sundays and Thursday mornings, deeper things, things about who they had been before they were who they were now. She told him about growing up on a farm outside of Waco with a mother who died when she was 12 and a father who meant well, and was not capable of managing his grief and hers at the same time, and how she had essentially grown herself up through those years, learning to be self-sufficient out of necessity, and finding that self-sufficiency, while it served her, had also made her sometimes hard to reach. He told her about growing up in a family of 5 in Seguin, his father a wheelwright, his mother a practical woman of great warmth, and about how at 17 he had set out for the Panhandle to work cattle and had never quite stopped moving, not from unhappiness but from a temperament that needed space and motion, and how he had begun to think in recent years that what he had been doing might also be understood as avoiding the thing he most needed to find. "Which is what?" she asked. He looked at her across the lamplit table. "Somewhere to stay," he said simply. She looked down at her plate. When she looked up, her eyes were brighter than usual, which was all the response he needed and more than he had expected, and they sat in the warm lamplight of the Ivory Rail and finished their supper and talked until Petey was clearly trying to close up, at which point they went out into the August night and stood on the board sidewalk in the warm dark. "I should get back," she said. "Yes," he agreed. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he said, "Della." The sound of her name in his voice was different from any voice she had heard say it, full of something deliberate and warm, and she looked up at him. "I know this is slow," he said. "I know you need it to be slow. And I'm telling you honestly that I don't mind the slow. I'm in no hurry except the one where I want you to know that what I feel is real and it isn't going anywhere. You can take whatever time you need. I'll be here." She held that for a moment. Then she reached up and touched his jaw, the lightest possible touch, just the tips of her fingers against his face, and he went very still and looked at her with those dark taking-in-everything eyes. "I know you will," she said. "I think that's why I stopped being frightened." She walked home. He stood on the sidewalk for a while after watching her go, and then he walked to where his horse was tied, and stood there with one hand on the mare's neck, and felt something in his chest that was clean and full, and as real as anything he had ever known. September came with a slow amber settling over the Texas landscape, the quality of light that makes everything look both harsher and more beautiful than it is. And in September, Della, Underwood, allowed herself to want something she had not allowed herself to want in 6 years. She wanted the future she had been refusing to imagine. She went to the Sunday walk, and she sat with him on the limestone ridge, and she said, Tell me what you want. Not what you think is appropriate to say, what you actually want. He was quiet for a moment, studying the far country. I want a place of my own, he said. Not large, enough to work, enough for horses. I've been saving since before I came to Redemption Creek, and I have enough now to put a down payment on a section of land if I can find the right one. Harlan has said he'll give me a reference for any bank in the county. He paused. I want to stay here, in this country. I want to stop being a man who passes through things. He turned to look at her. And I want you to be part of what I stay for, if that's something you want, in whatever way you're willing to allow it. She looked at the country for a long time. The wind moved through the dry grass below the ridge with a soft sound like breath. I've been so afraid, she said, not as an excuse, just as a fact she was offering him. For 6 years I told myself I was fine alone, and most days I was, but there were other days. She paused. I used to think that needing someone made you weak. I think now it just makes you honest. I think so too, he said. She took his hand. She had been doing this since July, taking or giving her hand in moments where the words were not quite enough, and he had learned to hold it with a steady warmth that communicated everything without demanding anything. And she had learned that there was a difference between a grip that traps and one that simply says, I am here. I want the future, she said. I want to stop building walls against it. I want to find out what it is when I'm not terrified of it. He turned to her fully and lifted his free hand and brushed a strand of hair back from her face with a gentleness that made something in her throat close. And then he said, Then let's find out. He kissed her for the first time on the limestone ridge in the amber September light with the wind moving over them. And it was unhurried and certain and warm. And when they separated, her eyes were still closed for a second. And then she opened them and looked at him with gray eyes that were, for the first time in a very long time, entirely unguarded. All right, she said, and she was smiling, the real smile, the one that had been under the polished one for 6 years waiting, and it changed her face entirely, and he looked at it like a man who could not believe his luck. October came in with the beginning of the cool and the turning of the scrub oak to brown gold. And Cecil Bancroft went to the Caldwell County Land Office and put a deposit on 120 acres 3 miles east of Redemption Creek, a section of land that had been briefly homesteaded and abandoned, with a creek running through the south end and a good limestone ridge on the north edge and soil that could grow things if you asked it properly. He told Della about the land before he bought it, which was the first thing, and he showed her the plat map. And she asked good practical questions about water access and road distance, and what the soil composition looked like, which were the questions of a woman who had grown up farming and still knew the right things to ask. He told Harlan Brooke he would be leaving the double spur at the end of October, and Harlan, who was a man of perception, shook his hand and said, It's been a genuine pleasure having you, Cecil. I hope you'll let me send work your way. Good horsemen are not easy to find. I'll be grateful for it, Cecil said. In October, he began the work of building on the land, and Esteban and 2 other ranch hands came on their days off to help raise the framing of a small house, which was rough but sound, the way things built by people who know their materials tend to be. He worked on it himself in the evenings and on Sundays, and Della came out on Sunday afternoons sometimes, and sat on the unfinished porch and watched him work and brought food and sometimes joined in on the parts she was capable of, which was more than he had expected, since she was a woman who had spent her life managing things practically and had good hands for practical work. You're going to need a root cellar, she told him, standing in the doorway of the half-finished house, assessing the interior with the serious eye she brought to everything. I know, I was thinking in the spring. Do it before the ground gets harder, she said. I know it looks like there's time, but there isn't. He looked at her and could not prevent the smile. Are you telling me how to build my house? I'm giving you good advice based on practical knowledge. You can take it or leave it. He took it. He dug the root cellar in October. November brought the question that had been gathering weight since September, and he asked it on a Sunday evening at the close of a day when they had worked side by side on the house from noon until the sun went low, and she had her back to him in the kitchen corner of the half-finished house, looking out the window hole that he had framed but not yet glazed, at the purple evening settling over the limestone ridge. "Della," she turned. He was standing in the middle of what would be the main room, and he had the expression of a man about to do something that required all his nerve, and she recognized it because she had spent enough months reading his face by this point to know what each variation of it meant. "I have been thinking about how to say this," he said, "in a way that doesn't put weight on you or make you feel like there is a clock running, because I don't want it to be that way. But I also think you deserve the full truth of where I stand, and where I stand is this." He took a breath. "I love you. I have loved you since sometime in January, and I have been careful about it because I understood that being careful was what you needed, and I don't regret being careful, but I would rather be honest with you now than careful." She stood very still, her back to the window, the purple evening light falling around her. "I'm not asking you for anything you're not ready to give," he said. "If what you can offer right now is to keep things as they are, I will take that and be grateful for it. But if you could ever see a way to marrying me, Della, I would like that more than I can say, because I cannot imagine building anything here without you in it." Silence. The wind moved through the unglazed window and touched her hair. She crossed the room in 3 steps and put her arms around him, which was the first time she had done that, held him with the full intention of holding, not the brief contact of hands but the whole solid presence of herself against him, and he held her back with a care and a wholeness that was all of what she had spent 6 years not believing she could have. "Yes," she said into his shoulder. "Yes, I would like that too." He held her tighter for just a moment and then pulled back enough to look at her face, and she looked back at him with the gray, unguarded eyes, and he kissed her forehead and then her mouth. And outside the unfinished window, the Texas November sky went from purple to deep blue, and the first stars appeared over the limestone ridge. They were married in December of 1883, which was exactly 14 months after Cecil Bancroft had ridden into Redemption Creek on a dust-gray mare with one white sock. The ceremony was held in the white church with the peeling paint, presided over by Reverend Ashby, and attended by most of the town, because Redemption Creek was a community that understood when one of its own had arrived somewhere worth celebrating, and because Della Underwood had been a fixture of this town for 6 years, and there were a great many people who had been quietly hoping for this outcome for a significant portion of that time. Agnes Prout sat in the front row and wept without any apology whatsoever. Josephine Calloway sat beside her and wept only slightly more discreetly, clutching her husband's arm. Esteban Ruiz stood with the double spur men in the back pew and was observed by several witnesses to blink rapidly at the ceiling on multiple occasions. Della had made her own wedding cake, which caused mild controversy among those who felt she should not be required to work on her own wedding day, but which she had insisted on because she trusted no one else to do it, and because she admitted to Agnes privately, enjoyed every minute of it. She wore the green dress she had been wearing since it was her nicest, let out slightly at the waist, and given a new collar of cream lace that Josephine had helped her add, and she carried a spray of dried wildflowers because the season was wrong for fresh ones and dried ones lasted. She stood at the altar and looked at Cecil Bancroft, who was wearing the good coat he had bought for the occasion, dark wool, which made him look substantial and serious, and exactly like himself in the best possible version, and she said her vows in a clear, steady voice, and did not once feel the locked-away fear that had preceded any notion of the future for 6 years. Because she was looking into the eyes of a man who had never once in all their months together made her feel that she had to earn the right to be exactly as she was. He said his vows in the low, quiet voice she knew well, looking at her the whole time, and when Reverend Ashby pronounced them married and he kissed her, the church erupted in the kind of applause that happens when a community has been genuinely invested in a story and has just received a very satisfying conclusion to the chapter they were all reading. They moved into the house on the Bancroft land, which by December had walls and a proper roof and glazed windows, and a fireplace that drew well, and the root cellar that Della had correctly insisted on before the ground hardened. It was small and it was plainly furnished, and it smelled of new wood and the cedar kindling that Cecil split in the evenings. And it was, Della thought, standing in the main room on the first morning of her married life with a cup of coffee warming her hands and the December sun coming in through the east window and her husband asleep still in the next room, the most completely inhabited space she had ever stood in. She had been in rooms her whole life. This was the first one that felt like the inside of something she had built by choice. The first winter of their marriage was quiet and full. They learned the daily texture of each other with the ease of two people who had been paying attention long enough that most of the learning had already been done. And what remained was the comfortable discovery of small things, that he woke before dawn with the ingrained habit of a ranch hand, and was always already dressed, and the fire built before she rose, that she talked to herself in low murmurs while she worked in the kitchen in a manner she appeared to be entirely unaware of, that he read whatever he could get his hands on in the evenings with a concentration that could make him entirely unreachable for an hour, that she had a habit of pulling her knees up to her chest when she sat, even in a chair, a habit of someone used to being small in uncertain spaces, that was slowly and with his patient attention beginning to ease. They went to church on Sundays, walked the limestone ridge when the weather allowed, hosted Agnes Prout and the Calloway family for supper in January, and in February, when the first real cold of the year settled over the land, they kept each other warm by the fire and talked in the way they had always talked, openly and honestly, two people who had both, in different ways, spent years being careful about their words, and had discovered that with each other words came without cost. In the spring of 1884, the roan mustang from the Double Spur was brought out to their land by Harlan Brooke, who had sold her to Cecil at a price that was clearly a generous one, because Harlan was a man who understood that some things belonged with the people who had earned them. Cecil introduced the roan to her new paddock with the same patient, unhurried care he had always used, walking the fence line first, letting her settle into the space, making no demands. Della watched from the porch railing and thought about the first day he had described the roan to her in the bakery, a year and a half and an entire lifetime ago. "She's beautiful," Della said. "She always was," Cecil said. "She just needed the right situation to show it." Della looked at him across the paddock fence. He was looking at the horse, not at her, which meant he may or may not have intended the secondary meaning of what he said. She decided it did not matter, because it was true either way, and she went back into the house and made the morning coffee and stood at the window while it brewed and watched her husband walk his horse around the spring paddock in the golden morning air, and felt something that she had a great deal of trouble naming because she had not had much practice with it. It took her several minutes to identify it cleanly. She was happy, without qualifications or protective clauses, without the familiar brace of anticipating what it would feel like when it was taken away. She was simply, in this moment, in the full and ordinary sense of the word, happy. She pressed one hand flat against the window glass and let the cool of it ground her, and then she called to him from the door about breakfast, and his voice came back over the spring morning, easy and warm. Summer of 1884 brought work and good crops and the news, delivered by Doc Henley from the main street of Redemption Creek, that Della was with child. She was 30 years old and she had been told by older women that having a first child later carried certain concerns, and Doc Henley was honest with her about what to watch and what to avoid, and she received all of this with the characteristic practical attention she brought to information she needed to act on. She told Cecil that evening after supper, sitting at the table with the lamp between them. She had been planning what she would say for the hour since she had left Doc Henley's office and had arrived at plain honesty, which was how they did everything. "Doc Henley confirmed it today," she said. "We're going to have a baby, probably February." He sat very still for a moment that felt long and turned out to be very short, and then he came around the table and knelt beside her chair and took her hands in both of his, and his face had an expression she had never seen on it before, open and unguarded in a way that was new even for him, something close to overwhelmed. "Della," he said, and couldn't finish. She smiled at him, the real smile that had started on the limestone ridge the previous September and had never quite fully gone away since. "Are you all right?" "I will be," he said, and laughed slightly, and she cupped his face in her hands the way she had touched his jaw that night outside the ivory rail all those months ago, and he turned his face into her hands. "We're going to do well," she said. "The two of us. We've already managed harder things." "I know," he said. He rose and held her, and she leaned into him, and they stayed like that for a while in the lamplit kitchen, with the summer night coming in through the window screens. And above the creek to the south the peepers sang, which they did every summer, which she would always from this point forward associate with moments of arrival. The pregnancy proceeded with the determined practicality that characterized Della in all things. She did not stop working. She reduced her hours at the bakery progressively, as Agnes Prout's insistence grew proportionally to the size of her pregnancy. And she kept her house and her garden and her autumn preserving. And she walked the ridge with Cecil every Sunday she was able until November made it inadvisable. And she had her husband's steady company in the evenings, and slept well for the first time in years. Agnes Prout came out to the Bancroft property twice a week, with what she described as surplus from the bakery, and what was in fact very specifically prepared food for a pregnant woman. And she sat in the kitchen with Della, and talked in the way of older women who have survived things, and want you to know that you will also survive things. And her presence was a comfort that Della did not diminish by refusing to accept it. November brought the annual meeting of the Caldwell County ranchers and landholders in Lockhart, which Cecil attended as a newly registered landowner, and he came back with word of the growing movement to bring the railroad spur further into the county, which would change the economics of cattle driving significantly. And they sat by the fire and talked about it, the way it would change what land in this county was worth, the way it might bring more settlers, the way it would shift everything. "I want to expand the property," Cecil said. "Not enormously, but the section north of the ridge is going to come available in the spring, and I'd like to make an offer if we can manage the financing." "We can manage it," Della said without hesitation, because she had been keeping the household accounts and knew what she knew. He looked at her. "You've worked it out already." "I worked it out in September," she said. "I was waiting for you to think of it." He shook his head slowly with the expression that had become one of her favorites, the one that was partly exasperation and mostly admiration. "You are extraordinary," he said. "I'm practical," she said. "Both," he said. February of 1885 brought their son into the world in a cold night, delivered by Doc Henley and attended by Agnes Prout, while Cecil kept the fire high in the main room and wore a groove in the floorboards that he would observe with some embarrassment for the next 20 years. The birth was difficult but not dangerous, and Doc Henley told him afterward that both mother and child were well, and he went into the bedroom and saw Della with their son in her arms, and she looked up at him with tired eyes that were entirely full of something vast and quiet. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was small and pink, and making the concentrated expressions of a person who had recently arrived in a world that seemed to require a great deal of adjustment. "He needs a name," Della said. "He does," Cecil agreed. They had discussed names for months in the manner of people who could not agree and enjoyed disagreeing about it enough to continue. He had favored practical names, names of men he respected. She had favored family names, or names with some shape to them. They had arrived eventually at the name they used without ceremony, James Thomas Bancroft. James for Cecil's father, and Thomas for no one named Aldridge but for Della's own father, whose name she had decided to carry into the future in a way that honored what was worth honoring without being anchored to what was not. James Thomas Bancroft arrived in February and did not sleep reliably for the first 3 months of his life, and was adored absolutely and without reservation by both his parents and by Agnes Prout and by Esteban Ruiz, who rode out from the double spur on a Sunday to see the baby, and stood looking at him in Della's arms with an expression of genuine awe, and by Josephine and her husband, and by most of Redemption Creek, which had a proprietary interest in the next generation of people it had watched arrive. In the spring of 1885, Cecil Bancroft made the offer on the north section of land, and it was accepted, and the Bancroft property grew to 240 acres, enough for the small horse-breeding operation he had been thinking about since the roan's first foal was born in March, a bay colt with good lines, and a temperament that suggested he would be worth something to the right buyer. They broke ground on a proper barn in April, with Esteban and 2 other hands helping on a Saturday, and George Fry, who had retired from the double spur and was living in Redemption Creek with his wife, came out and helped as well, working with the careful deliberateness of an older man who still knew what he was doing. Della cooked for all of them. She stood in the yard at the outdoor fire with James on her hip, stirring a pot of beans that were better than most things available at the Ivory Rail, and she talked to George Fry's wife and watched Cecil work, and felt the ease of a life that was functioning exactly as she had imagined it might if she had ever allowed herself to imagine in those years when she had carefully not done so. The summer of 1885 was the summer the railroad came to the edge of Caldwell County, not to Redemption Creek specifically, but close enough that the town felt the change in its economic weather. New families began to arrive. The Hofstetter Mercantile expanded. A second doctor came and opened a practice in a building on the main street that had previously been a saddler's. Agnes Prout began to think about whether she might take on a second baker, and found herself thinking with some frequency of a young woman who had come with one of the new families and who had shown an interest in the work. Agnes came to Della with the idea on a Sunday after church, which was when she came to Della with most ideas that she expected would require some processing. "I am not replacing you," Agnes said immediately. "I want to be plain about that." "I know," Della said. She was not offended. She was, if she was honest, something like relieved, because she had been thinking for some time about the question of what the next stage of her life looked like, and it had occurred to her that she might not need to bake bread for Agnes Prout forever in order to be financially secure, now that the land was expanding and the horse operation was beginning to turn actual income. "What I would like," she said to Agnes, "is to continue 1 or 2 days a week if you'll have me, and hand off the rest. I could use the time here." Agnes looked at her with a long, measuring look that contained several years of watching Della Underwood at close range. "You're happy," Agnes said. "Yes," Della said. Agnes put both hands on Della's face in the manner of a woman who had the right, kissed her on the forehead, and said, "Good. You always deserve to be." That fall, Della began teaching herself to work with the horses alongside Cecil, not breaking them herself, which required a physical strength she respected without possessing, but in the handling and the gentling, the work of building trust, which she turned out to have a considerable and not entirely surprising talent for. The horses responded to her in the way that things responded to her, cautiously at first, and then with the kind of confidence that comes from a steady presence that makes no sudden moves. Cecil watched this with the quiet pleasure of a man watching someone discover something true about themselves. "You're good with them," he said one October afternoon as she led the roan's second foal around the paddock on a halter rope with James, now 20 months old, perched on the fence rail watching with enormous interest. "They need patience," she said, looking at the foal rather than at him. "So do people," he said. She turned to him then and smiled, the real smile. Still there, still his, still the most transforming thing in his experience of the world. "Is that what you were offering me?" she asked. "When you kept coming to the bakery every Thursday, patience." "That's part of it," he said. "What was the other part?" He came to the fence rail and leaned on it beside her, looking at the foal. The belief that whatever was under all those walls was worth being patient for, he said. She was quiet for a moment. The October light came over the north ridge and lay in long gold bars across the paddock. Was it? She asked, not fishing for a compliment, genuinely asking, in the way of a woman who has spent years needing the honest answer. He looked at her with the full directness of those dark eyes that took in everything. Della. Every single day of my life for the past 2 years I have understood with total clarity that being where I am and being with you is the best piece of luck I have ever had or will ever have. He paused. Yes, it was worth it. Every Thursday. She leaned her head against his shoulder for a moment, and James on the fence rail said "Dada" in the satisfied tone of a toddler who finds his parents' proximity appropriate. And the foal moved to the water trough, and the October afternoon went on in the way of good things, quietly and without interruption. Christmas of 1885 was celebrated at the Bancroft property for the first time, a gathering that grew, the way Bancroft gatherings were beginning to grow, beyond its intended scope and into something that required 3 tables end to end in the main room, and a fire that ran from early morning to late night. Agnes Prout was there, the Callaways, George Fry and his wife. Esteban Ruiz, who was now 19 and working his own small operation near the Creek Road, came with a Christmas ham he had smoked himself. Harlan Brooke and his wife rode in from the Double Spur. Reverend Ashby came with his sister who was visiting from San Marcos. Della cooked from 3 in the morning and was flushed and laughing by the time people arrived, standing in her kitchen with James on one hip and a wooden spoon in the other hand. And when Cecil took the boy so she could finish the last preparations, she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the main room full of people she loved, and could not, for a long moment, make herself move back to the stove because the sight of it was too much. Cecil, crossing the room with James in his arms, caught her expression as he passed, and he stopped and looked at her with a question in his eyes. "I'm just," she said and stopped. "I'm just very glad." He touched her face briefly, the back of his knuckles, the lightest possible thing. "So am I," he said. James reached out and grabbed Della's nose, which concluded the moment in the manner that toddlers tend to conclude moments, and the room erupted in the laughter that was becoming the signature sound of this house in the years of its fullness. In the spring of 1886, Della found out she was expecting their second child. She told Cecil in the same plain way she had told him the first time, and he received it in the same fashion he had received the first news, with a moment of stillness, and then the reaching for her hands. But there was a difference this time, a certain ease in it, the ease of people who have done this before and know that they can, who have built something sturdy enough to hold more. "November, Doc Henley thinks," she said. "I'll get the north bedroom finished before then," he said. They had been using it as storage since the expansion. "You have 8 months," she said. "I'll get it finished in April," he said, which was both practical and a declaration of intent, and she knew the difference. He had the north bedroom finished in April. He built a small second cradle himself from the cedar wood that grew along the creek, and it took 3 weeks of evenings because he wanted it to be good, and James sat on the floor of the workshop in the old barn and handed him things with great seriousness, because he had reached the age at which handing things constituted meaningful contribution. The summer passed in the rhythms it always passed in now, the horsework and the land work and the preserving, and the Sunday walks on the ridge, and the weekly drives into Redemption Creek for church and supplies, and the evenings by the fire with Cecil reading and Della doing the mending, or the accounts, or the correspondence she had taken up with a few women in neighboring towns who she had met at the county fair and found worth knowing. She had also begun, quietly and without announcing it, to help women who were new to the area and arriving without the established connections that made life on the frontier manageable. She remembered what it had been to be alone in the practical sense, the absence of the network that people who had been somewhere long enough took for granted, and she made sure that new families knew where the good doctor was and whose credit could be trusted, and where to go when there was trouble. And she did this without calling it anything or expecting recognition for it. Which meant that the people she helped often described her afterward with a particular warmth and a slight puzzlement at their own inability to articulate what exactly it was she had done. Cecil knew what she did. He saw the pattern in her days and the faces of the people who came to their door and went away differently than they arrived. He said one evening, watching her write a long and practically detailed letter to a woman in the next county who had written asking about the county's water situation, "You know you have more effect on people than you know." "I just give people information they need," she said. "That's not nothing," he said. "Out here, that's sometimes everything." She looked at him over the lamp. "You're going to say something else." "I was going to say that the woman you were 6 years ago who was trying very hard to need nothing and no one would not have recognized herself doing this." She thought about that. "No," she said finally, "she wouldn't. She thought needing people and helping people were the same thing, that if you let anyone in you became dependent. She had the whole thing backwards." "What changed it?" She looked at him steadily. "You did," she said. "You stood close enough long enough that the fear just went." He crossed the room and kissed her once on the top of her head, which was a habit of his that she had come to consider one of her favorite things in the world, and she returned to her letter. November of 1886 brought their daughter, Clara Agnes Bancroft, named Agnes for the woman who had given Della both employment and friendship in the years when she had nothing else to stand on. Agnes Prout, informed of the name, sat down in a chair in her kitchen and wept with the lack of any composure whatsoever, which was very unlike her, and which Della and Cecil regarded with the combination of tenderness and slight alarm that good news occasionally produces. Clara was a dark-haired baby of definite opinions, who slept better than her brother had, and nursed with a vigor that suggested she had arrived knowing exactly what she needed and how to obtain it. James, now nearly 2, regarded her with initial suspicion that softened within a week into the particular devotion of a firstborn child, who has decided the new addition is acceptable. Cecil held his daughter on the second evening, sitting in the chair by the fire with the lamp low and Della resting in the bedroom and James asleep in his small bed, and he looked at the baby's face in the firelight with the complete attention he gave to things he was trying to understand, and the baby looked back at him with the unfocused but earnest regard of a newborn who is taking the world's measure for the first time. He thought about what it was to have built this. Not the house, which was just boards and lime plaster, but the thing inside the house, the daily fact of two people who had found each other and meant it, the morning coffee and the Sunday walks and the hands that found each other across a paddock fence, the honest conversations by the fire, the way she laughed now, freely and often, the way she had stopped needing to hold the walls up, and he thought about where he had been before this, the man who had kept moving because he could not articulate what he was looking for, and how completely that motion had resolved into this stillness, this particular chair by this particular fire with this small, dark-haired person in his arms. "Hello, Clara," he said quietly. "I'm your father. I intend to always be here." The baby blinked at him solemnly. From the bedroom doorway, Della said in a tired and deeply warm voice, "She already knows that." He turned. She was leaning in the doorway in her nightgown, her brown hair down around her shoulders, a lamp in her hand, and she looked at him with the gray eyes that were entirely open and had been for some time now. "Come back to bed," she said. "In a minute," he said. "She's looking at me." "She'll look at you for the next 30 years, Della said. "Come to bed." He rose with the baby against his shoulder and crossed to her, and they stood together in the doorway for a moment before going back into the warm room. And outside, the Texas winter was coming on across the flat country, and the stars were sharp over the limestone ridge. And inside the Bancroft house there was firelight and the smell of cedar and the settled quiet of a family in its early hours. The years that followed were the years of the life they had built together, each one adding something and removing nothing essential. The horse operation grew into a small but respected business in Caldwell County, with Cecil's reputation for producing well-handled animals spreading through the neighboring counties, through the particular word-of-mouth economy of ranching communities, where a trustworthy horse was a practical necessity, and a good-tempered one was a luxury that people were willing to pay for. James grew into a quiet and observant child with his father's dark eyes and his mother's practical intelligence, who at 5 was already spending his mornings at the paddock fence, watching the horse work with the concentrated interest of someone who was learning something he intended to use. Cecil began teaching him in the patient, methodical way he taught everything, and James received these lessons with the same still attention, so that by the age of 7 he was capable of leading a haltered horse with a competence that made visitors to the property do a double take. Clara was a different nature entirely, loud and curious, and absolutely committed to being involved in everything regardless of whether she had been invited, a quality that her parents regarded with the combination of exasperation and private delight that is the particular territory of children who are impossible and wonderful simultaneously. She had Della's directness and a social ease that belonged entirely to herself, the child of parents who had both learned self-sufficiency but who had raised her in the security of not needing it as armor. In 1889, when James was 4 and Clara was 2, Cecil acquired a second section of land to the south, bringing the Bancroft operation to 360 acres, which was not a large ranch by the standards of the big operations in South Texas, but was a solid and entirely self-sufficient working property, debt-free by the time of the purchase through the careful accumulation that was the product of two people who both understood the value of a dollar and the patience of a long plan. Redemption Creek itself changed with the decade's end, the way towns change when the railroad reaches them properly, which it did in 1888 when the spur finally came through and the town tripled in size over the following 2 years. New streets were added. The church was rebuilt in stone. The Ivory Rail became a proper hotel and restaurant. A school was established in a building on the new North Street, and Della was on the founding committee of the school, which was the kind of practical civic contribution that she had been making in various forms since she had stopped being the woman who needed nothing. Agnes Prout retired from the bakery in 1890 and sold it to the young woman she had trained, who was now 24 and entirely capable, and she moved into a comfortable room at the boarding house that had been her home for most of her adult life, and came to the Bancroft property for Sunday dinner every week without interruption, until she died at the age of 77 in the winter of 1892, peacefully, in her sleep, which was the death of someone who had done enough and rested with the satisfaction of it. Della carried that loss with a steadiness that had nothing to do with not feeling it. She felt it thoroughly, the way you feel the absence of something that was always there, and she wept for Agnes without apology, and Cecil held her through it with the particular quality of presence he had always offered, close and steady, and without trying to fix what was not fixable, and she was grateful in the way she had been grateful for that quality of his from the beginning, the understanding that some things need to be felt completely and not managed away. James, who was 7, asked at the funeral why Mrs. Prout had died, and Della told him honestly that she had been old and her body had finished its work, and that this was the way of things, and that Mrs. Prout had been happy and had had a good life, and that it was all right to be sad about missing someone and also all right to be glad for what they had been. James considered this with the expression of his father at its most thorough. "Will you and Papa die?" he asked. "Yes," Della said. "Eventually, a long time from now." "I don't want you to," he said. "I know," she said. "Neither do we. That's why we intend to stay around for a very long time." She pulled him into her side and looked down at his dark head. "And until we do, we're going to be right here. Every morning you wake up." He put his arm around her waist and held on, and she held him back, and Clara appeared from behind a gravestone where she had been examining something of geological interest and said, "Are we going home now?" with the absolute present tense focus of a 4-year-old, and the grief did not leave, but it was surrounded by life, which is how grief is meant to be carried, not alone in a sealed room but held inside the ongoing warmth of everything that continues. By 1893, when James was 8 and Clara was 6, and Della was 39 and Cecil was 42, the Bancroft property had become one of the established fixtures of the eastern section of Caldwell County, known for good horses and a reliable neighbor, and a woman who knew more practical things about more practical subjects than most people would think to ask, and who gave that knowledge freely to anyone who came to the door. There was a third child in 1894, a boy they named William George Bancroft, George for old George Fry, who had died the previous year, and whose friendship had been one of the genuine pleasures of their early married life. William arrived in April in a spring rainstorm that kept everyone inside, and arrived faster than either Doc Henley or Cecil had anticipated, which resulted in Cecil delivering his own third child on the bedroom floor with Della's very specific instructions, and a composure on his part that she later described, with considerable warmth, as the most impressive thing she had ever witnessed, which was saying something given that she had witnessed him go into a burning barn for horses. William was a red-haired baby who would remain red-haired his whole life, a fact that caused his parents endless mild confusion, given that neither of them could account for it through any family history they knew, and which Esteban Ruiz, who came to visit the new baby and laughed for what felt like several minutes, described as a clear sign that the universe had a sense of humor. The three children grew in the way children grow when they are raised in a house where love is not scarce and work is not avoided, and the adults are honest with them about the nature of things, which is to say, with the confidence of people who understand where they stand. James, who entered the county school at 7 and was reading above his grade within a year, was going to be someone of consequence. Clara was going to run something. William, red-haired and cheerful and in permanent motion, was going to make people very happy and occasionally drive them to the edge of their patience. In the spring of 1895, on a Sunday afternoon that could have been any of the hundreds of Sunday afternoons they had spent walking the limestone ridge east of Redemption Creek, Cecil Bancroft stood at the top of the ridge with his wife beside him and looked out over the flat country with the particular quality of attention he had brought to this view for 12 years. The country was green with spring, which happened maybe 3 months a year, and was therefore a thing worth standing in. The Bancroft property spread below them to the northeast, the house and the barn and the paddocks and the garden, and the stands of post oak along the creek edge. The town of Redemption Creek was visible to the west, larger than it had been when he rode into it on a gray mare in 1882, but recognizable still, the church and the water tower and the lines of the streets. Della stood beside him with her arm through his, a posture she had arrived at naturally over the years, this particular way of standing with him, connected but not dependent, present but not merged, which was them exactly. 12 years, she said, and some months, he said. Do you remember what you said to me that first summer on this ridge? I said I wanted to stop being a man who passes through things, he said. Yes, she looked at the country. Have you? He turned to look at her instead of the view, because the view, though it was beautiful, was not what he had been looking at for the past 12 years when he stood at this spot. He had been looking at her, the way the wind moved her hair, and the way she named the things she loved in the landscape with the precision of someone who had been paying attention, and the way that standing up here was the one place where he had first seen her look out into the world without any walls between herself and it. She had been, when he found her, like the roan mustang in the corner of the paddock. Not mean, not broken, just frightened by too much that had happened too fast. And he had done what he did with horses. He had not tried to remove the thing that frightened her. He had just stood close, consistently and without demand. And over time, the fear had become something smaller than she was. I've never felt like passing through anything since the day I rode into this town, he said. She looked at him, and it was the gray, unguarded look that still, after 12 years, had the same effect on him that it had had on the limestone ridge in September of 1883. Entirely open, entirely trusting. The look of a woman who had learned, with difficulty and patience and the help of someone who had been worth the learning, that her heart was not simply a place that had been marked by damage. It was a place where something had grown, stronger for the wound's healing, more honestly held because it had once been lost. She reached up and touched his face, the gesture from outside the ivory rail, all those years ago, and said, "Neither have I, not for a single day." He covered her hand with his, and they stood in the spring wind on the limestone ridge. And below them the Bancroft land lay in the morning light, and inside the house James was probably already in the paddock, and Clara was probably already organizing something that did not need organizing, and William was probably already into something he had been told twice to leave alone. And their life, the full, warm, ordinary, extraordinary life they had built from the beginning of wanting something true, was exactly where it was supposed to be. "Ready to go back," he said. She looked at the country one more time the way she always did, naming it in her quiet interior way, fixing the moment. "Yes," she said. And she meant the land below them and the house at the end of the path, and the children in the yard and the man beside her and the life inside all of it. The life she had once believed she did not deserve to want, that had found its way to her anyway, through one patient Thursday morning at a time, one Sunday walk at a time, one hand quietly held in the dark. They walked back down the ridge together in the spring morning, his hand in hers, and the Texas sky was blue and clear and very wide above them, and Redemption Creek lay below in the sunlight, and the Bancroft property in its full good life received them as they came through the gate together, and the gate swung closed behind them with the satisfying sound of something that is exactly where it belongs.